Before the plague doctor became a symbol of death and dread, Europe carried on in rhythms that were familiar, fragile, and, at least on the surface, stable. It is here, in the twilight of an ordinary medieval town, that our story begins. The year is the early 14th century. The continent has seen wars and famines, uprisings and famines again, yet the people carry on as people always do. Their lives are full of toil, small pleasures, and routines that feel timeless. Picture the town. At its heart stands a market square, its center a patch of trampled earth bordered by wooden stalls and stone buildings. Here, traders set out their wares with practiced hands. Sacks of barley and rye, cuts of salted meat, cheeses wrapped in cloth, bolts of homespun wool. The air is a blend of savory and sour fresh, bread cooling on boards, fish carried in from the coast, all sloshing in wooden jugs, and the unmistakable tang of livestock. From the square, crooked streets branch outward like veins. They are narrow, more often mud than cobble, and in places so tight that neighbors could lean out from their windows and shake hands. The houses lean forward on their upper stories, their timber frames blackened by smoke and their plaster painted with lime wash in faded colors. Roofs are of thatch or wooden shingles, their angles uneven and patched. At the base of each dwelling lies a threshold of worn stone, smoothed by the tread of countless feet. Life here is noisy, vibrant, and raw. Blacksmiths strike iron at their forges with a ringing clang that carries far down the street. Tanners scrape hides in pits that reek of lime and urine. Candlemakers dip wicks into vats of melted tallow, while bakers draw loaves from brick ovens that radiate heat, even into the open air. Children chase one another through puddles, their laughter mingling with the braying of donkeys and the barking of dogs. Overhead, church bells toll the hours, summoning the faithful to prayer or announcing the start of market trade. Yet for all this motion and sound, survival is never guaranteed. Illness lurks in every corner, though most of it is ordinary by the standards of the age. Fevers that sweep through a household, coughs that worsen with the cold, stomach sickness from spoiled food or foul water. Women risk their lives in childbirth, and men face injuries in fields or workshops that may never heal properly. Few families are untouched by grief. Small graves fill churchyards as regularly as the seasons turn, and death, though mourned, is accepted as part of the order of things. The people seek comfort where they can. Faith is their constant guide. In the mornings, monks shuffle to chapels to sing the hours, their chants drifting through the mist. Parish priests bless fields and livestock, hoping for good harvests and protection from storms. The calendar is marked with feast days and holy days, times when work pauses and the community gathers to celebrate with music, dancing, and shared meals. On such days, laughter fills the same streets where sorrow often walks, and for a time the hardships seem lighter. Evenings bring another rhythm. As the sun dips, shutters are closed against the chill. Families huddle by hearth fires, their rooms smoky and dim, lit by rushlights dipped in fat. They eat simple meals, pottage of grains and beans, perhaps a scrap of pork or a slice of bread if fortune is kind. Afterward, stories are told, tales of saints and heroes, of tricksters and ghosts. These spoken histories knit the generations together, carrying memory and wisdom through the years. Beyond the town, fields stretch into the distance, parceled into strips of farmland, tilled by peasants who owe rent or labor to their lords. In autumn, carts creak beneath sheaves of harvested grain. In spring, oxen drag plows through damp earth. Villagers know the cycle well, planting, tending, reaping, storing, and their lives rise and fall with the weather and the soil. To them, hunger is as familiar as the seasons. A poor harvest may mean lean months, and a second poor harvest may mean true famine. Travelers still come and go along the roads, though their pace is slow. Pilgrims pass through with badges pinned to their cloaks. Merchants carry spices or silks from afar, and wandering minstrels sing for coin or food. With them come news of distant kingdoms, of wars fought, of treaties signed. Rumors of strange diseases flicker now and then. Illness in Asia, fever in the ports of the East. But to most in the town, such tales feel remote, more like stories than warnings. For the moment, life continues as it always has. The people rise with the dawn, labor through the day, and rest as darkness falls. They fear storms, famine, and fire far more than they fear some invisible pestilence from distant lands. Yet, unseen, the storm is gathering. Along the trade routes that tie this town to a wider world, something is moving. A sickness unlike any they have known, silent for now, but merciless once it arrives. In hindsight, history teaches us that this calm is fragile. But to those living in the town, there is no sense of impending doom. They sweep their thresholds, mend their garments, tell their stories, and laugh with their children. The world seems hard enough already, yet still survivable. It is only later, when the black tide reaches their gates, that the meaning of hardship will be rewritten entirely. So let us pause here in this moment of uneasy peace, in a town not yet struck by calamity. The bells still ring, the bakers still knead, and the children still play in the streets. The storm has not yet broken, but the clouds are already gathering on the horizon. Soon, the shape of a new figure will emerge, a figure dressed in black, with a long beaked mask, stepping into history as both healer and omen. But for now, we remain in the stillness before the storm, listening to the heartbeat of a world about to change forever. The calm of the medieval town, with its routines of labor and prayer, was not to last. Beyond its gates, beyond its familiar lanes and fields, the world was stirring with forces unseen. A shadow, small at first and barely noticed, had begun to creep westward. In ports along the Black Sea, in markets crowded with merchants and sailors, rumors had already begun to spread, whispers of a sickness that felled men and women with terrible speed. It began, they said, in the lands far to the east. Some spoke of it arising in China, others in the steppes of Central Asia, carried by traders along the Silk Road. Caravans brought more than spices and silks, they carried rats, fleas, and the invisible seeds of plague. Ships, too, became vessels of contagion, their holds filled with grain and vermin alike. Wherever the merchants traveled, the sickness seemed to follow, like an unwelcome stowaway. By 1346, it reached the great trading hub of Kaffa on the Black Sea. There, a Genoese colony came under siege by Mongol forces. According to some accounts, when plague struck the besieging army, they hurled the bodies of their own dead over the walls, a grim weapon meant to spread fear. Whether true or embellished, the story speaks to the terror that accompanied the disease. Soon after, Genoese ships fled the port, carrying sailors who were already infected. Wherever those ships made landfall, death followed. By 1347, the sickness arrived in the Mediterranean. It appeared first in Messina, a bustling port in Sicily. The town's chroniclers wrote in horror of how the disease struck suddenly, filling the harbor with cries and confusion. Sailors staggered ashore with fevers and swellings the size of eggs. Within days, the town's streets grew silent, shutters drawn tight, markets abandoned. The plague had made its entrance into Europe. From Messina, it spread swiftly, carried by trade routes, as if the very veins of commerce had become conduits of doom. Marseille and Genoa were next, their busy harbors transformed into gateways of pestilence. The sickness leapt inland, following the paths of wagons, horses, and foot travelers. In the crowded cities of France and Italy, entire households were struck down within days. Priests, nobles, peasants, none were spared. The disease's symptoms were terrifying in their suddenness. Victims first felt a chill, then heat, as fever gripped them. Swellings, called buboes, appeared in the groin, armpits and neck, tender and blackened. Spots erupted on the skin, dark and spreading, as though the body itself had been bruised by some unseen hand. Many coughed blood, their lungs filling as if drowned from within. Death came quickly, often within 3 days. The healthy could fall ill in the morning and be gone before the next dawn. News of this spread faster than the sickness itself. Messengers, pilgrims, and merchants carried word ahead of the pestilence. Their tales of horror exaggerated by fear but grounded in truth. A great mortality is upon us, they said. No cure is known. Whole households vanish in days. In towns still untouched, people listened with unease, unsure whether to believe. Some dismissed it as a distant calamity, one that might never reach their doors. Others sensed that the stories carried the weight of prophecy. By the autumn of 1347, Florence felt the first brush of the plague. The city, proud of its wealth and learning, would soon be humbled. Writers of the time described how people abandoned their neighbors, how fathers left children and wives left husbands, desperate to flee contagion. Boccaccio, who later immortalized the time in his Decameron, wrote of corpses piled in the streets, of gravediggers who themselves succumbed before finishing their work. The plague did not merely kill, it unraveled the bonds of family and community, and still, it spread further. Across the Alps into France and Germany, across the Channel into England. London would not escape, nor would the villages scattered in its countryside. The sickness moved with terrifying inevitability, finding paths wherever men and animals traveled. By the spring of 1348, the entire continent seemed to tremble under its shadow. For those who lived in the towns and villages, the plague appeared almost supernatural. How could something unseen strike with such ferocity? Many turned to religion for explanation. Some said it was a punishment from God, a scourge sent to cleanse the world of sin. Others feared it was the work of malign stars, their alignments casting sickness down upon humanity. Still others whispered of conspiracies, poisoned wells, secret plots by outcasts and strangers. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion bred violence. But there were those who sought more practical understanding. Physicians, though bound to the old theories of humors and miasmas, began to note patterns. They recorded symptoms, tracked where the disease appeared, and searched for causes. They believed foul airs carried the contagion, invisible vapors that seeped into the lungs. To protect themselves, they prescribed aromatic herbs, fumigations, and purifying fires. In the face of catastrophe, their remedies were meager, yet they laid the groundwork for what would become the figure of the plague doctor. For now, however, the plague doctor did not yet stride the streets. The people faced the terror largely alone, priests with their prayers, families with their desperation, and healers with their dwindling faith in ancient methods. The whisper of pestilence had become a roar, and Europe stood on the brink of a calamity that would leave scars not only on bodies but on memory itself. In the quiet of the towns not yet reached, people carried on with their lives, but always with unease. Each cough, each fever, each shadow on the horizon seemed a possible herald of the plague. Children still played in the mud, bakers still sold their bread, monks still rang their bells. Yet beneath the surface lay a growing fear, like a chill wind seeping through a cracked door. The storm was no longer distant. It was coming, and it would change everything. By the late 1340s, as plague raged across Europe, towns and cities faced a terrible dilemma. Their people were dying in vast numbers, their priests and monks overwhelmed, and their traditional healers exhausted or themselves carried away by sickness. Something had to be done. Out of this desperation emerged one of the most haunting figures in the history of medicine, the plague doctor. It is tempting to imagine that plague doctors appeared instantly with their long, beaked masks and heavy black robes, but in truth, their arrival was gradual, born of necessity. At first, communities relied on their usual healers, physicians schooled in the universities, surgeons trained by apprenticeship, and apothecaries who mixed herbs and ointments. But as the mortality grew unbearable, these practitioners often fled, unwilling to face the danger. Some were forbidden from leaving by civic decree, while others simply vanished, seeking safety in the countryside. City councils, desperate to care for the sick and to maintain some sense of order, began to contract men specifically for the task of treating plague victims. These contracts were often written formally, with terms of pay, duties, and privileges clearly outlined. The new role was not born from honor, but from grim practicality. Someone had to step forward into the chaos, and if ordinary physicians would not, or could not, then others would be sought. Thus, the position of plague doctor took shape. At first, the men who took these contracts varied widely. Some were trained physicians, young and ambitious, eager to build reputations even amid danger. Others were barber surgeons, accustomed to bloodletting and minor operations, but with little experience of great epidemics. Still others had no training at all. Laymen, apothecaries, or even opportunists who saw a chance to earn money and status. The plague did not discriminate in whom it struck, and the same was true of those who dared confront it. The contracts promised pay, though it was often uncertain. In some cities, plague doctors received a salary of several florins per month, along with food, lodging, and exemption from certain taxes. In others, they were granted the right to collect fees from the estates of their dead patients, a grim form of compensation. Some cities offered bonuses if the doctor survived his service, others promised burial expenses if he did not. It was a dangerous bargain, but for men of few means or limited prospects, it could seem worthwhile. To the people of the town, the arrival of a plague doctor was both reassuring and frightening. On one hand, here was a figure dedicated to confronting the sickness directly, someone willing to step into houses where others dared not go. On the other, his presence was an ominous sign. A plague doctor walking the streets meant the pestilence was near, that death had already crossed the threshold. Children peered from windows as he passed, adults watched in silence, crossing themselves or muttering prayers. At this early stage, the plague doctor did not yet wear the full costume that later centuries would make iconic. His clothing was more ordinary heavy cloaks, gloves, and hoods meant to protect him from foul air. Many carried staffs, or canes to prod patients, or to keep their distance. Masks with glass eyepieces and long beaks would come later, but already the idea was present, that to survive, the doctor must shield himself from invisible poison in the air. What united these early plague doctors was not their appearance but their purpose. They were hired to treat, to record, and, sometimes, to witness. Their duties included examining the sick, offering remedies, and reporting the spread of disease to the authorities. Some were instructed to perform autopsies, hoping to find the cause of the sickness in the organs of the dead. Others were tasked with keeping lists of the afflicted, recording who lived and who perished. Their remedies, of course, were bound to the medical understanding of the time. They prescribed bleeding and purging, herbal poultices and fumigations. They advised diets of dried figs, onions, or bitter herbs, and warned against bathing, believing that open pores allowed the pestilence to enter. They burned incense, scattered herbs on floors, and urged the carrying of posies or pomanders. Though ineffective against the true cause of plague, these measures reflected the best knowledge they had, rooted in centuries of tradition. In truth, the role of the plague doctor was as much symbolic as practical. Few expected them to cure the sickness entirely. Rather, their presence gave shape to a community's response. They embodied the attempt to resist despair, to impose order where chaos threatened. In their contracts, their tools, and their daily rounds, they became a visible sign that the town was not wholly abandoned to death. For the doctors themselves, the work was a mixture of duty, opportunity, and dread. Some approached it with genuine compassion, tending the sick as best they could, holding the hands of the dying when no one else would. Others treated it as business, performing their duties perfunctorily, avoiding close contact whenever possible. and some, inevitably, were accused of exploiting the misery around them, charging excessive fees or abandoning patients at the first sign of danger. Over time, as the plague recurred in wave after wave, the image of the plague doctor hardened into something more distinctive. Their costume became codified: the long waxed robe, the leather gloves, the wide, brimmed hat, and most memorably, the beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs. This figure, part healer, part omen, would haunt the streets of Europe for centuries. But in the earliest days, before the mask became legend, the birth of the plague doctor was more ordinary, more human. It was the story of men hired to step where others would not, of contracts written in desperate ink, of towns that sought to fight back against the invisible enemy, with whatever means they could muster. The beak and the black robe would come later, but already the silhouette of the plague doctor was beginning to emerge, shaped not by science, but by fear, necessity, and the stubborn will to endure. And so, in the midst of whispers and wails, a new figure took his first steps into history. A figure who would forever be bound to the memory of plague, both feared and pitied, both absurd and tragic. The plague doctor was born, not as a savior, but as a man who walked willingly into the shadow where so few dared to tread. If the plague doctor was born of necessity, his survival depended on parchment and ink, contracts, simple words written by scribes and sealed by councils, became the backbone of his existence. These agreements tied him to a community, bound him to his duties, and offered him, in return, the faint promise of security in a time when little could be guaranteed. It is a curious thought that in the midst of chaos, with bodies filling churchyards and fear choking every street, the townspeople turned to something as orderly as a written contract. Yet such was the medieval mind. Even disaster had to be organized, and even death could be managed through law. When a town found itself overwhelmed by plague, its leaders gathered, mayors, magistrates, or aldermen, to decide how best to respond. Their coffers strained, their citizens in panic, they resolved to hire a physician dedicated solely to plague sufferers. A scribe dipped his quill, and the contract was drawn. The terms were both precise and grim. The plague doctor was to visit the sick and the dying, to examine their swellings, to apply remedies, and to record the course of the illness. He was to provide reports to the council, noting the spread of disease through the town. Often, he was also charged with inspecting the dead, ensuring accurate counts for burial and inheritance. In return, he was promised payment. Some contracts offered a monthly salary, measured in florins, ducats, or livres depending on the region. Others gave the doctor housing within the town, food delivered to his door, or exemption from certain taxes and civic duties. A few contracts added unusual clauses. The doctor might be promised a bonus if he survived, or guaranteed that his family would receive compensation should he perish. The sums varied widely. In Florence, some plague doctors received 30 florins a month, a respectable income. In smaller towns, the pay might be only a few coins, barely enough to tempt a learned physician. It was for this reason that many plague doctors were not the celebrated masters of medicine, but rather young men seeking a start, or older practitioners in need of money, or even individuals with scant training, but a willingness to risk their lives for a wage. There were protections written into these contracts too. Doctors were sometimes forbidden from treating wealthier patients, outside their plague duties, lest they be distracted from their grim task. Others were prohibited from fleeing the town while their service lasted, under penalty of forfeiting pay, or even facing punishment. The council, in effect, tethered the doctor to the fate of the city, binding him as tightly as any citizen who could not escape. To modern ears, these agreements may sound cold, but to the medieval mind they were practical. A town needed order, even amidst pestilence. A doctor needed assurance that his work, dangerous as it was, would be recognized. And so, through careful words on parchment, both sides struck their bargain. Imagine the scene: a doctor, perhaps young, perhaps wary, standing before the council chamber. The scribe reads aloud the contract, the clauses echoing in the hall. The doctor nods, knowing he is about to step into houses heavy with sickness, into alleys where silence and weeping are the only sounds. Yet he presses his seal to the document, for in that seal lies not only payment, but a strange form of honor. He is now officially the plague doctor, bound to his community's suffering. Some of these men took the contract with a sense of duty, believing their service might truly save lives. Others accepted with resignation, knowing it was dangerous, but feeling they had no other choice. Still others viewed it simply as employment, a way to earn coin when work was scarce. Whatever their motives, once the contract was signed, their lives changed utterly. For the people, the existence of such a contract was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting, because it meant the town had taken steps to address the crisis, that someone had been appointed to face the pestilence directly. Unsettling, because the need for such a figure confirmed the gravity of the situation. To hear that a plague doctor had been hired was to know that death was near, so near that a council had put quill to parchment in desperation. Not all contracts ended well. Some doctors died within weeks, their pay scarcely earned. Others fled despite the clauses, vanishing into the countryside when fear overcame duty. A few grew wealthy, collecting salaries through successive outbreaks, though their reputations were often stained by whispers of greed. Still, the contracts remained, renewed again and again, as the plague returned in cycles. In time, these documents would become part of the lore of plague doctors, their words copied into records that survive even now. They reveal, more clearly than any mask or robe, the true nature of the role, a man hired to face the unfaceable, compelled by duty, necessity, or coin. The ink upon the page was as binding as any chain, holding him in place while the world around him sickened and died. And so, the plague doctor was not merely a shadowy figure wandering streets in a strange costume. He was also a man who had agreed, formally and in writing, to serve his town in its darkest hour. His contract was a promise, imperfect though it was, that humanity would not surrender wholly to despair. The beaked mask and the black robe would make him legend, but the parchment sealed with wax made him real. It was here, in the words of his contract, that the plague doctor's identity truly began to take shape, not only as a healer, but as a witness, an agent of order amid chaos. Bound by ink, he stepped into history, walking with both the weight of death and the faint light of duty upon his shoulders. If the contract gave the plague doctor his role, the costume gave him his image. The sight of a man walking through narrow medieval streets, dressed in long black robes, gloves, and a mask with a bird-like beak became one of the most enduring and unsettling symbols of plague. It was a uniform not of honor or prestige, but of dread. To see it meant death was near. The famous plague doctor outfit as we imagine it today did not appear fully formed in the earliest years of the Black Death. Rather, it developed gradually over the course of repeated outbreaks, refined with each return of pestilence. By the 17th century, the costume had taken on its iconic shape. But its roots lay in the practical fears of medieval medicine and the theories of contagion that dominated the age. The foundation of the outfit was the long robe, made of heavy fabric, often canvas, oilcloth, or leather. It was waxed to resist moisture and clung stiffly to the body. The robe extended from the shoulders down to the ankles, concealing every part of the physician's frame. Its purpose was simple: to prevent the pestilence from touching the skin. At a time when miasma, or foul air, was believed to seep into the body through pores, such covering was considered vital. Over the robe came gloves of soft leather, drawn tight at the wrists. These allowed the doctor to touch the sick, to prod buboes, to take pulses, without direct contact. Boots or leather shoes completed the lower half, often secured under the robe, so that no part of the leg was exposed. Around the waist, some doctors tied a cord or belt, from which hung pouches for herbs, knives, or vials of medicines. The wide, brimmed hat was a mark of the medical profession. Broad and stiff, it shaded the doctor's eyes, but more importantly, it signaled to all who saw him that he was a man of authority. The hat's silhouette was unmistakable, rising above the crowds, moving steadily through streets where few dared linger. Most iconic of all was the mask. At first, plague doctors covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or perfumes, or with simple veils. But as fears grew, the mask evolved into something far more striking. It consisted of a leather or metal frame fitted with glass eyepieces and a long, curved beak. The beak, hollow inside, was packed with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, camphor, or vinegar-soaked sponges. These scents were believed to purify the air, filtering out the miasmas that carried disease. The length of the beak kept the doctor's face at a distance from the patients, an added barrier against contagion. To the people of the town, the mask was terrifying. Its bird-like profile transformed the doctor into something inhuman, a creature half man and half carrion bird. The reflective glass of the eyepieces concealed any trace of expression, rendering the doctor unreadable. When he entered a home, he seemed less a physician than a messenger of fate, a dark bird come to perch at the bedside. Children hid behind their mothers, even adults whispered prayers as he passed. The outfit was completed with the doctor's staff, usually a wooden cane or rod. It served many purposes. With it, the doctor could point to swellings, lift bedclothes, or direct assistance without touching anything directly. It also kept desperate patients at a distance, for many in their fevered state clutched at him, begging for relief. To onlookers, the staff gave the doctor an even more spectral air, as though he moved through the streets, not quite touching the earth, directing life and death with a gesture of his rod. Though we know now that the costume offered little real protection against the true source of plague, the bite of fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, it was not without merit. The waxed robe and gloves did provide some barrier against contact with contaminated fluids. The mask, though ineffective against microscopic bacteria, at least encouraged the idea of filtering the air, a step toward later understandings of contagion. And perhaps most importantly, the costume gave the doctor courage. Encased in layers, breathing through herbs, he could believe himself safer than he truly was. In such belief, he could continue his grim work. For the townspeople, the appearance of the plague doctor in full costume carried a double meaning. On one hand, it was terrifying, a sign that the pestilence was present in their midst. On the other, it was strangely reassuring here was someone, however ominous in form, who had chosen to face the sickness. In the black robes and beaked mask, death had a face, but so too did defiance. Imagine the ritual of dressing. A doctor begins at dawn, drawing the heavy robe over his body, tying the cord at his waist. He pulls the gloves onto his hands, the boots onto his feet. He settles the wide, brimmed hat upon his head, then fits the mask, adjusting the straps until the beak sits firmly before his face. He lifts the staff, tests its weight, and steps into the street. Each movement is deliberate, a small ceremony of preparation. Outside, shutters slam, and whispers pass along the lane. The doctor is here. Thus attired, the plague doctor became both man and symbol. He was at once a physician and an omen, a healer and a harbinger. His clothing, meant to protect, transformed him into something unforgettable. Centuries later, long after the plagues receded, the image would remain etched in memory, the figure in black, with a long beaked mask, walking slowly through the silence of stricken towns. It was a costume born of fear, yet it gave form to resilience. To dress for death was also to resist it, however futilely. And so, in each town where plague struck, The strange silhouette of the plague doctor reminded all who saw him that humanity, though wounded, would not simply surrender. Of all the details of the plague doctor's attire, none captured the imagination more vividly than the beak. Long and curved, it lent the doctor the profile of a giant bird, half human and half raven. To the people of plague-stricken towns, this strange visage became a spectre of dread. Yet the beak was more than mere ornament. It was a carefully designed instrument, rooted in the medical theories of the time. To understand its purpose, one must step inside the mask itself. The air of medieval cities was thought to be corrupted during plague. Physicians spoke of miasma, poisonous vapors that seeped invisibly through the atmosphere, rising from rotting matter, stagnant water, or even the bodies of the sick. To breathe unfiltered air was, in their view, to invite illness into the lungs. The beak was devised as a remedy, a filter of sorts, to protect the physician who could not avoid close contact with the afflicted. The interior of the beak was hollow, a small chamber that could be packed with aromatic substances. Doctors filled it with dried herbs, flowers, and roots. Lavender, mint, and rosemary were common choices, their strong scents thought to cleanse the air. Camphor crystals, pungent and penetrating, were highly prized, as was vinegar-soaked sponge, damp and acrid. Sometimes exotic spices such as cinnamon, cloves, or myrrh were added, costly ingredients brought by traders from far-off lands. In times of desperation, even more curious items found their way into the beak. Tobacco, juniper berries, or scraps of leather steeped in oils. The mixture was not random. Many plague doctors followed recipes passed down through medical manuals or city directives. One such prescription recommended a blend of roses, carnations, and camphor, combined with storax resin, aloe, and vinegar. Another called for nutmeg and ambergris, that rare waxy substance from the belly of whales, valued for its perfume. These concoctions were believed not only to purify the air, but also to fortify the doctor's own body against corruption. To inhale sweet or spicy odors was to strengthen the vital spirits within. Imagine, then, the experience of wearing the mask. The leather pressed tight against the face, the glass eyepieces dimming the world, and before the nose and mouth, the beak filled with herbs. With every breath, the doctor inhaled a sharp, fragrant mixture, part floral, part medicinal, part overwhelming. Hours passed in this scented confinement, until the herbs grew stale, and the mask had to be refreshed. From the outside, the effect was uncanny. Patients lying in bed would look up to see a looming figure, with a long black silhouette, a gleaming beak, and dark lenses where eyes should be. Some saw in it the raven, a bird of ill omen, circling carrion. Others thought of the stork, believed to deliver infants, and wondered at the strangeness of a healer, dressed as a bringer of both life and death. Children shrank back in terror, convinced that the bird, man, was a demon or angel sent to judge the household. Yet for the doctor, the mask offered more than protection. It gave a sense of separation. Encased in layers of cloth and leather, breathing through herbs, he could imagine himself apart from the sickness that surrounded him. This psychological armor was as important as any physical defense. Without it, the constant presence of death might have crushed his resolve. With it, he could endure a little longer, moving from house to house, patient to patient. Modern science tells us that the beak was no true safeguard. The herbs did not kill the fleas that carried plague bacteria, nor did they block the microscopic agents of disease. Yet they may have offered some small relief. The strong odors could mask the stench of decay that filled plague houses, sparing the doctor's senses from horror. The vinegar sponges may have had mild antibacterial qualities, though insufficient to halt the plague. And perhaps the very act of wearing the mask discouraged the doctor from touching his own face, a habit that could spread infection in unseen ways. Symbolically, the beak carried other meanings. Birds were often associated with death in medieval imagination. Ravens and crows, scavengers of battlefields, appeared in omens and tales. To see a doctor in bird-like form was to see death itself walking the streets. But there was another side to the image: the bird as a protector. Just as the stork was thought to guard homes, or the crane to guide travelers, so too did the bird-faced doctor become, in time, a figure of grim guardianship. The design of the beak even influenced behavior. Its length kept the doctor's face at a distance from his patients, discouraging close contact. This, unintentionally, may have reduced the risk of exposure to droplets of blood or sputum. The staff he carried served as an extension of this principle. No need to touch what could be pointed to, moved, or examined at a distance. It is easy now to mock the beak as a superstition, a costume more theatrical than medical. But in its own time, it represented a step forward. It was an attempt, however flawed, to create personal protective equipment. It acknowledged that disease could be carried in the air, and that barriers might help preserve the health of those who cared for the sick. In this sense, the beak was an ancestor to the masks and respirators used in later centuries, when science at last discovered the invisible agents of contagion. Picture again the doctor preparing his mask. He selects herbs from his pouch, crumbles dried rosemary, sprinkles camphor crystals, wets a sponge with vinegar. Carefully he stuffs the beak, packing it until the scent rises sharply to his nostrils. He ties the mask to his face, checks the straps, and lowers the hat over his brow. Outside, bells toll for the dead. Inside, the bird-faced physician takes a steadying breath of herbs and steps into the next house, into the next hour of danger. The beak was no cure, but it gave courage. It was no shield, but it offered a kind of ritual protection. And as long as plague stalked the land, the strange mask with its hollow chamber of herbs would remain a companion to those who dared to confront death. When we picture the plague doctor, it is often as a figure silently gliding through the streets, a symbol more than a man. But behind the mask and robes was a human being tasked with work both necessary and unbearable. To step into his shoes is to glimpse not just an outfit, but a life defined by routine danger and constant sorrow. What did it truly mean to be a plague doctor? Each day began before the sun rose. The doctor awoke in whatever lodging the city had provided. Sometimes a guest house, sometimes a small room near the edge of town, occasionally quarters within the very walls of a hospital. Dressing was a solemn ritual, the waxed robe drawn over his body, gloves fitted snugly, boots tied, mask packed with herbs, hat perched, staff in hand. The costume was as much armor for the mind as for the body. With each piece, he reminded himself that he was stepping into a battlefield of disease. The first task was visitation. The plague doctor walked through assigned districts, moving from house to house where sickness had been reported. Often, a city official or servant guided him, pointing out which doors had been marked. Families left signs, a piece of cloth tied to a doorpost, or chalk marks indicating plague within. Entering these homes, the doctor would find scenes of suffering, swollen buboes, fevered moans, the faint smell of decay already clinging to the air. He examined patients with care, though always at a distance. Using his staff, he lifted blankets, pointed at swellings, or gestured for a patient to open their mouth. Pulse taking was done through gloves, light and quick. He noted the stage of illness, early fevers, suppurating sores, the terrible blackening of limbs that signaled the end. In his ledger, he recorded names, symptoms, and outcomes. These records, though grim, were among the few medical accounts preserved from plague years. Treatment was limited, yet he was expected to provide what care he could. He might lance a bubo to release foul pus, apply poultices of onion or vinegar, or recommend bloodletting to balance the humors. He offered herbs for fevers, concoctions of rue or wormwood, or draughts of theriac, a costly compound with dozens of ingredients. Few of these remedies helped, yet they gave patients the sense that something, anything, was being tried. Beyond the sick room, the plague doctor performed other duties. He inspected corpses, confirming deaths for official records. He wrote certificates stating cause of death, vital for inheritance and legal matters. In some cities, he also advised councils on measures to contain the pestilence, the burning of infected bedding, the closure of markets, or the isolation of households. His voice carried weight, though he was often as uncertain as anyone about which measures worked. Perhaps most difficult of all were the moments with the dying. Families begged him for hope, clutching his robes, imploring him to save loved ones. Parents asked if their children might live. Children asked if their parents would recover. The plague doctor could offer little certainty. Sometimes he whispered prayers. Other times he urged confession, for death often followed swiftly. His presence was both a comfort and a signal. If the doctor stood at your bed, the end might be near. The work was relentless. At times, he might visit dozens of homes in a single day, moving from one fevered room to the next. The air was thick with odors, smoke from hastily lit fires, vinegar poured over floors, the sickly sweet scent of decay. His mask filtered little, yet the herbs gave him courage to endure. Outside, the streets echoed with funeral bells, carts creaking under loads of bodies, priests chanting hurried prayers. Evenings offered no true rest. After removing his gear, he sat to compile reports: how many had fallen sick, how many had died, what remedies had been tried. These reports went to city officials, who weighed them against mounting losses. The doctor's writings were often clinical, stripped of emotion, yet behind the numbers lay exhaustion. Each entry was a life extinguished, another family broken. The plague doctor lived with isolation. Many townsfolk avoided him, fearing that he carried the very sickness he treated. Children pointed from afar, but few approached. Even colleagues, barber surgeons, apothecaries, priests, kept their distance. Only in the company of fellow doctors did he find kinship, sharing notes on treatments, comparing observations, debating theories of air, humors, or divine punishment. Risk shadowed every moment. The mask and robe were no true shield. Many plague doctors fell ill themselves, succumbing to the very disease they tried to confront. Some died within weeks of beginning their service, their contracts unfulfilled. Others endured, moving from one outbreak to another, haunted yet hardened. Each morning they donned the mask again, stepping back into the fight against an enemy unseen. And yet, there were small glimmers of meaning. For families abandoned by neighbors, the doctor's visit was a reminder they were not entirely forsaken. For city officials desperate for order, his records provided some measure of control. For the doctor himself, there was the faint hope that observation and experience might one day lead to better remedies. In this way, the work was not only grim duty, but also a step, however stumbling, toward the growth of medicine. Picture him at the close of a long day. He removes the mask, sets aside the staff, and washes his hands with vinegar. He writes by candlelight, the room silent but for the scratch of his quill. Outside, the bells toll again, marking yet more lives lost. He pauses, wary, and wonders if tomorrow will bring relief, or only more sorrow. Then he lowers his head, prays quietly, and prepares to begin again at dawn. The work of a plague doctor was not glorious, nor was it often successful. Yet it was necessary. To walk into homes others fled, to face the sick and dying, to record and to comfort. This was the task of those strange, bird-faced men. Their daily labor, though shrouded in fear, became a testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming despair. If the work of the plague doctor was grim, the remedies he carried were stranger still. To modern eyes, many of the cures attempted during plague years seem futile, even grotesque. Yet each was rooted in the medical knowledge of its age, built upon centuries of tradition, observation, and desperate hope. In a world where the true cause of plague remained invisible, treatment became a blend of ritual, experiment, and imagination. At the heart of medieval medicine lay the theory of the four humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to depend on a balance among these fluids. Sickness, then, arose when one humor overflowed or waned. The task of the physician was to restore harmony, often through methods that purged or redirected the body's fluids. Bloodletting was among the most common treatments. Using sharp knives or applying leeches, doctors drew blood from veins in the arm, neck, or even near the swellings themselves. The logic was simple: if excess blood caused the fever, draining it might ease the body. In practice, it often weakened patients further, leaving them faint and vulnerable. Yet families demanded it, and physicians obliged, hoping each incision might tilt fate toward recovery. Another favored remedy was the lancing of buboes. Swollen and painful, these black or purple swellings were thought to contain the corrupted matter of the disease. With careful pressure, a doctor pierced them, releasing foul, smelling pus. The wound was then covered with poultices of onions, butter, or vinegar. Some healers sprinkled powdered herbs, others applied hot irons to cauterize the site. Relief was fleeting, but the act gave the sense that something had been done, that poison had been drawn out. Herbal concoctions abounded. Wormwood, rue, sage, and rosemary were brewed into bitter teas. Garlic was mashed into pastes and spread across the skin. Theriac, a legendary compound of dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh and opium, was prized as a universal antidote. Costly and rare, it was sometimes diluted into syrups, sometimes swallowed whole. To drink theriac was to believe that one had armed oneself with the most potent shield available. Vinegar, with its sharp sting, was considered cleansing. Floors were scrubbed with it, clothes soaked in it, hands washed in it, after visits to the sick. Some households placed bowls of vinegar in corners, letting the sour fumes rise into the air. Others mixed vinegar with crushed herbs, creating pungent fumigations that filled rooms with acrid smoke. The belief was not wholly misguided. Vinegar does have mild antiseptic properties, but against plague, it was but a drop of hope in a flood of despair. There were stranger treatments still. Some physicians recommended carrying dried toads in pockets or pressing them against swellings, believing the creatures would draw out poison. Others advised wearing jewels of emerald or sapphire, thought to repel corruption. In some towns, pigs were driven through the streets, so that the animals might absorb the pestilence, their bodies acting as sponges for invisible miasma. Fires were lit at crossroads, their smoke intended to cleanse the air, while households burned fragrant woods, or even piles of clothing in an effort to chase away the sickness. Diet, too, was adjusted. Patients were urged to avoid rich meats, and instead eat light broths or barley gruel. Wine was recommended in moderation, red for strength, white for cooling fevers. Some healers prescribed abstinence from fruit, fearing it would corrupt the stomach, while others swore by the cleansing power of ripe figs or sour pomegranates. The rules shifted from town to town, yet all carried the belief that what entered the body shaped its fate. Not all cures were gentle. Desperation led to harsher measures. Scarification, in which the skin was cut in hopes of drawing out bad humors, the application of arsenic or mercury ointments to buboes, even induced vomiting through bitter draughts. The patient endured agony, often worsening their condition. But the healer believed in the necessity of such violence. Better to suffer now than succumb to corruption later. Prayer and ritual held equal weight with these physical remedies. Priests urged confession, fasting, and processions of penitence. Pilgrims walked barefoot to shrines, carrying candles and chanting hymns. In some cities, flagellants whipped their own backs until blood ran, offering their suffering to God in exchange for mercy. The plague doctor, though a man of medicine, often stood beside priests, combining poultices with prayers, herbs with blessings. To heal body and soul together was thought essential. And yet, for all these treatments, the plague often ran its course untouched. Patients died despite bloodletting, despite lanced buboes, despite prayers whispered over them. Families buried loved ones despite burning herbs, despite vinegar baths, despite costly theriac. Remedies eased fears more than they halted death. Still, they carried meaning. In doing something, anything, people felt less helpless. The rituals of cure gave shape to hope, even when hope was fragile. Imagine the plague doctor preparing his satchel at dawn. He places small vials of vinegar, jars of herbs, rolls of bandages, a box of leeches. He tucks a silver spoon for measuring theriac, a knife for lancing, a pestle for grinding roots. These are his tools, humble yet weighted with expectation. Families look to them as lifelines, though he knows their power is slight. Still, he carries them with care, for each represents an effort to resist despair. The remedies of plague times remind us of medicine's long journey. What seems futile to us was, for them, reasoned and sincere, a tapestry woven from ancient learning and urgent invention. In the strange brew of garlic, vinegar, jewels, and toads lay the seeds of a truth. That people will try anything, risk anything, to ward off death. In the end, the cures were less about conquering the plague, and more about enduring it. They gave patients and families rituals to cling to, actions to perform, signs that they were not abandoned. And perhaps that was their greatest gift. Not healing, but comfort in a world where certainty had vanished. The plague was more than a physical sickness. It was also a sickness of the spirit, a creeping dread that seeped into the thoughts of every man, woman, and child. To live in a plague-stricken town was to live with fear as a constant companion, whispering in every silence, lurking in every shadow. Fear shaped choices, altered customs, and wove itself into the very fabric of daily life. It began with uncertainty. People did not know why the sickness struck, nor how it spread. One neighbor might fall ill while another seemed untouched. A healthy child could be laughing in the morning, fevered by nightfall, lifeless by dawn. This unpredictability left people searching for explanations, and in their search, they turned to the familiar powers of faith and superstition. Many believed the plague was divine punishment. Priests preached that the pestilence was sent by God as chastisement for sins of greed, pride, lust, and neglect of the poor. Processions of penitents filled the streets, men and women walking barefoot, singing hymns, carrying candles. Some whipped their own backs until blood flowed, offering their suffering as sacrifice to appease heaven's wrath. Church bells tolled endlessly, summoning the faithful to confession, prayer, and mass. In monasteries, monks prayed without ceasing, their chants rising like a shield against invisible foes. For others, the plague was the work of darker forces. Rumors spread of witches brewing poisons, of Jews casting spells and poisoning wells, of lepers smearing contagion on doors. Suspicion grew sharper with each wave of death, and in many towns it erupted into violence. Innocent people were tortured, exiled, or slain. Scapegoats offered to satisfy a terrified populace desperate for someone to blame. Superstition, when fueled by fear, often turned cruel. Charms and amulets became common companions. People wore strings of beads carved from bone, talismans etched with holy verses, or small bags filled with herbs and ashes. Children were given crosses to hang about their necks. Mothers sewed protective symbols into garments. Fathers hung sprigs of rosemary above doorways. The faithful clutched relics of saints, convinced that a splinter of bone or scrap of cloth could ward off pestilence. Astrology, too, offered its guidance. Learned men studied the heavens, noting the alignments of planets and stars. Some declared that the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had corrupted the air, unleashing plague upon the earth. Charts were drawn, predictions made, and the sick sought comfort in knowing that the stars had spoken. If the heavens had caused the pestilence, perhaps the heavens might one day lift it. Everyday behavior changed in ways shaped by fear. Neighbors avoided each other in the streets. Doors were barred, shutters closed, voices hushed. Some families fled to the countryside, seeking safety in isolation. Others stayed close to churches, hoping proximity to holy ground would offer protection. In towns, fires burned at crossroads, their smoke meant to cleanse the air. In homes, incense smoldered, filling rooms with sharp, heavy scents. The plague doctor himself became a vessel for these mingled currents of fear and faith. His bird, like mask, inspired awe and terror, a walking omen of death. Yet his presence was also seen as a kind of ritual. Herbs in his beak, vinegar on his gloves, prayers whispered alongside treatments. To many, he seemed half physician, half priest, embodying the strange mixture of science and superstition that defined the age. Imagine a family huddled in their home. A child coughs in the corner, the mother clutches a rosary, the father sprinkles vinegar on the threshold. Outside, a procession of flagellants chants hymns, their voices carrying through the night. Bells toll in the distance, mingling with the cries of mourners. Overhead, the stars gleam cold and indifferent. In such a world, fear pressed upon the heart like a weight, and faith, however expressed, was the only counterbalance. Yet superstition also offered comfort. To wear a charm, to light a candle, to whisper a prayer was to act against helplessness. Even if the act had no true power, it gave a sense of control in a world that had spun beyond comprehension. Fear without hope is despair. Fear tempered with ritual becomes survivable. The smallest gesture, the faintest belief, could help carry a family through one more night. Of course, not all faith was blind. Some clerics spoke gently of compassion, urging care for the sick and burial for the dead. Some scholars sought natural explanations, writing of foul air, unhealthy diets, or environmental corruption. In their way, they too were planting seeds of reason that would one day grow into modern science. But in the moment, fear ruled strongest, and superstition often filled the gaps where knowledge faltered. The legacy of plague, time superstition endures in memory. We remember the charms, the candles, the processions, the scapegoats. We remember, too, how fear made people turn both to the heavens for hope and against their neighbors in blame. It is a reminder that in times of crisis, the human heart seeks meaning, sometimes in kindness, sometimes in cruelty, always in the attempt to make sense of chaos. As bells tolled across Europe, as masks of birds walked the streets, as prayers rose and rumors spread, the plague was fought not only with herbs and knives, but also with faith and superstition. These were weapons of the spirit, as vital to survival as any potion or poultice. In the end, fear was everywhere. Yet so too was belief, flickering like a candle in a darkened chapel. And though neither fear nor faith could stop the plague, they carried people through its long shadow, one day, one prayer, one superstition at a time. To speak of plague is to speak of numbers, of deaths counted, of families emptied, of towns hollowed. Yet behind the tallies and records lay something deeper, the unraveling of society itself. The pestilence was not only a disease of the body, but of communities, governments, and traditions. When death stalked every street, the bonds that held people together began to fray, and the toll was measured not only in lives lost, but in the changes wrought upon the world. The first and most visible toll was demographic. Entire neighborhoods were left deserted. In some cities, half the population perished, in others more. The Black Death of the 14th century, the most infamous of plagues, reduced Europe's population by nearly a third. Villages vanished altogether, their fields reclaimed by weeds and silence. Churches that once rang with choirs stood empty, schools closed, their masters and pupils gone. For survivors, the world felt eerily hollow, a landscape stripped of familiar voices. Families bore the brunt of the devastation. A child might lose both parents within a week, left to wander among strangers. Parents buried children with their own hands, their grief numbed by repetition. Entire lineages were extinguished, names erased from memory in a matter of weeks. Marriage patterns shifted as widows and widowers remarried quickly, desperate to rebuild households and secure livelihoods. The structure of kinship itself bent under the weight of so much death. Economies, too, faltered. With so many laborers dead, fields lay unplowed, harvests rotted. Workshops fell silent. Merchants closed shops, unable to find buyers or workers. Trade routes shrank as towns barricaded themselves against outsiders, fearful of new infection. Inflation surged in some regions, while in others, wages rose sharply because labor was scarce. A peasant who once toiled for little pay might suddenly command better terms, altering centuries-old balances between landowners and workers. Thus, from ruin came upheaval. Society's very hierarchy began to tremble. The toll on governance was equally severe. City councils struggled to maintain order, their members dying one by one. Records became patchy, decrees went unenforced, tax collection faltered. Kings and lords imposed quarantines, banned gatherings, and restricted movement, but enforcement proved difficult when even the guards fell ill. Some rulers fled their capitals altogether, leaving frightened subjects to fend for themselves. The absence of leadership deepened the sense of abandonment, feeding suspicion that earthly powers were no match for divine wrath. Religious institutions suffered a double wound. On the one hand, the church grew more central than ever, as people sought salvation and explanation. On the other, its credibility faltered when prayers failed to halt the pestilence. Priests died in droves, especially those who stayed to administer last rites. Monasteries were emptied, their chants silenced. Survivors sometimes turned bitter, questioning the church's ability to intercede with God. Faith endured, but cracks appeared, cracks that in centuries to come would widen into reform and schism. Social trust collapsed in many places. Neighbors shunned one another, fearful of contact. Travelers were viewed with suspicion, sometimes barred from entering towns. Those who fell ill were sometimes abandoned even by family, left to die alone behind locked doors. Burial rites, once solemn and communal, grew hurried and impersonal, as bodies piled faster than they could be laid to rest. In some cities, carts carried the dead by the dozens, unceremoniously heaped into mass graves. The dignity of the individual, once preserved through ritual, was stripped away by necessity. Yet the toll was not only in loss, it was also in change. Survivors inherited lands, shops, and wealth left behind by the dead. Entire estates passed into new hands. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, suddenly became attainable. A humble farmer could rise to prosperity. A merchant's son might marry into nobility. A laborer could command wages that secured his family's future. Out of devastation, opportunity emerged, reshaping the social fabric in ways both subtle and profound. Communities adapted in other ways as well. Cities experimented with new systems of health boards, quarantine stations, and sanitary regulations. Though often crude, these efforts marked early steps toward public health. Record-keeping, too, grew more systematic as officials struggled to track deaths and causes. Even as societies reeled under the weight of loss, they laid the groundwork for new forms of resilience. Still, the psychological toll was perhaps the hardest to measure. Survivors carried scars invisible yet deep. Some were haunted by guilt. Why had they lived while loved ones perished? Others hardened their hearts, suppressing grief to endure another day. Art and literature of the period reflect this shadow skeletal figures in paintings, grim tales of pestilence, poems steeped in sorrow. Yet alongside darkness bloomed a sharpened appreciation for life, for fleeting joys, for the fragility of human existence. Picture a marketplace after the plague's passage. Where once stalls bustled, only a handful remain. Where children once ran, silence lingers. The faces that gather are marked by weariness, their eyes older than their years. Yet still, the market functions. Still, bread is baked, cloth is woven, trade resumes. Society, though battered, limps forward. This was the toll, not annihilation, but transformation. The plague unmade the world as it was, and forced the birth of something new. Death had thinned the ranks of humanity, but it had also shifted power, altered traditions, and sown the seeds of change. The toll on society was immense, whole generations scarred, but it was not final. From the wreckage, people rebuilt, carrying with them the memory of what had been lost and the hard lessons learned. And so, when we look back at the figure of the plague doctor, moving through empty streets, we see not just a man in a mask, but a symbol of a society under siege, one that bent, nearly broke, yet endured. The toll was terrible, but within it lay the story of survival, of adaptation, and of humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. When we speak today of the plague doctor, most people picture a dark figure in a long cloak, crowned with a wide-brimmed hat, and above all, that haunting beaked mask. It is an image that lingers in art, costume, and imagination, a symbol both grotesque and fascinating. Yet behind the familiar silhouette lies a legacy that is layered, complicated, and far removed from the everyday reality of those who once wore the costume. To trace the legacy of the plague doctor is to see how history transforms men into myths. At the time of their work, plague doctors were rarely celebrated. They were often outsiders, hired from distant towns or regions precisely because locals feared their own physicians might refuse the duty. Some were young, inexperienced men eager to prove themselves. Others merely opportunists, or those desperate for employment in desperate times. They were contracted with little glory, often with strict rules about where they could live, how they could practice, and even what would happen to their belongings if they died. For their contemporaries, plague doctors were practical necessities. Grim, unsettling, but hardly heroic. Yet centuries later, they are remembered less for their cures, which seldom worked, and more for their appearance. The beak-like mask, filled with herbs, was not widespread in the early years of the Black Death. It emerged in the 17th century, particularly in France and Italy, as a response to the belief in miasma, the poisonous airs thought to spread disease. The design was intended as protection, a primitive form of hazmat suit. To later eyes, however, the mask seemed uncanny, animal, like almost theatrical. It is this strangeness that ensured the plague doctor's survival in memory, long after their medical practices were forgotten. Artists in later centuries seized upon the figure. Woodcuts and etchings of plague doctors became popular, often exaggerating their appearance. Some were drawn to instill fear, others to satirize. In carnival traditions, particularly in Venice, the mask found a second life as a costume, worn in parades and masked balls. Thus, the figure that once walked streets heavy with death became, paradoxically, a fixture of celebration. The transformation from grim professional to festive character is one of the most curious elements of their legacy. Writers, too, played their part. Chroniclers of the plagues described plague doctors with a mixture of awe and dread, noting their eerie presence in the streets. Over time, these descriptions blurred fact and fiction, painting the doctors as mysterious, almost otherworldly. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as interest in medieval history grew, the plague doctor was rediscovered as a symbol of the dark past, a reminder of an age when death was ever present and medicine was as much ritual as science. In modern times, the legacy of the plague doctor has grown even stranger. They appear in films, novels, and even video games as ominous figures, sometimes villains, sometimes protectors, sometimes merely eerie background presences. Their mask is instantly recognizable, its outline alone enough to conjure a sense of unease. In times of modern epidemics, images of the plague doctor sometimes resurface in art and satire, as though reminding us that humanity's struggle against invisible enemies is an old, recurring story. But their legacy is not only in symbol and art. On a more practical level, the plague doctors represented one of the earliest attempts by governments to create a form of organized public health response. By hiring doctors specifically for plague duty, city councils acknowledged that disease was not just a private misfortune, but a civic crisis. Records of these contracts, detailing wages, duties, and conditions, offer some of the first glimpses of state-directed healthcare, however crude. In this sense, the plague doctor can be seen as a forebear of modern emergency medicine. They also left a legacy of caution, a reminder of how limited medicine once was. Their fumigations, bloodlettings, and poultices rarely saved lives, yet their very presence showed that people clung to the idea of treatment, however ineffectual. The plague doctor is thus both a symbol of human error and of human determination. We see in them not just failure, but the stubborn refusal to abandon hope, even when hope seemed impossible. The emotional legacy is harder to measure, yet just as important. Imagine the comfort, however small, that a plague doctor's arrival might have brought to a household drowning in despair. Even if the treatments offered little, the sight of a figure who came willingly into infected homes may have reassured families that they were not entirely abandoned. Fearful though he looked, the plague doctor embodied the fragile thread of care that tied a sick bed to the wider world. Today, when his image is used in art, costume, or satire, it carries echoes of all these meanings at once. He is the reminder of death, of folly, of resilience, of humanity's endless battle with disease. He is both comic and tragic, grotesque and oddly noble. The beak, once stuffed with rosemary or cloves, now stands as a metaphor for all the ways humans have tried to make sense of what they could not see or understand. To speak of legacy is to admit that the plague doctor has outlived his own relevance. The profession itself faded centuries ago, as medicine advanced and contagion came to be understood not as foul air, but as microscopic life. Yet even in disappearance, the figure endured. If you walk the streets of Venice during Carnival, you may see him, now a mask of papier-mâché, worn by a reveller, transformed from healer to spectacle. And if you leaf through the pages of modern fiction, or gaze upon a painting, you may find his shadow still, lurking in the corners of imagination. The plague doctor's legacy is not the cures he offered, but the image he left behind. It is a reminder of how history remembers not always the truth, but the symbol. In his beak and cloak we see both the terror of the past and the creativity with which humanity endures it. We see the limits of old knowledge and the persistence of hope in the face of despair. We see, perhaps, a reflection of ourselves, still grappling with unseen enemies, still seeking comfort in rituals and masks. And so, the legacy of the plague doctor is a legacy of paradox, failure and resilience, fear and fascination, death and remembrance. He no longer walks our streets, yet his presence remains, haunting and instructive, a ghostly companion reminding us of the long, winding path of medicine and the stubborn endurance of the human spirit. When pestilence swept through medieval towns and villages, people turned instinctively to the powers they trusted most: the heavens above, the saints in their shrines, and the rituals that gave life meaning. For most, medicine was a distant, uncertain art, practiced by a handful of physicians whose remedies rarely helped. Faith, on the other hand, was woven into every moment of life, from birth to burial. And so, when the plague advanced like a shadow across the land, faith became both shield and compass, even as it faltered under the weight of unanswered prayers. Church bells tolled ceaselessly during outbreaks, summoning the healthy and sick alike to prayer. Processions wound through narrow streets, banners of saints fluttering above the crowds. Men and women walked barefoot, some with ropes around their necks, carrying candles or crosses as they begged for mercy. Priests led litanies, invoking the Virgin Mary. Saint Sebastian, long regarded as a protector against plague, and Saint Roch, who was believed to have healed plague sufferers through his compassion. Churches echoed with chants, incense thickened the air, and desperate voices cried out for deliverance. Yet devotion could take darker forms. One of the most striking responses was the rise of the flagellants. These were bands of penitents who traveled from town to town, whipping their own backs until blood streamed down their robes. They believed that by reenacting Christ's suffering, they might atone for humanity's sins and lift the divine punishment of plague. Crowds often gathered to watch, moved to tears or seized by terror at the spectacle. For some, the flagellants were living proof of repentance. For others, they were unsettling, even heretical. The church itself often disapproved, wary of movements it could not fully control. Superstition, too, flourished where medicine failed. Amulets and charms were worn against infection, sprigs of rue or rosemary, relics of saints, tiny parchment scrolls inscribed with prayers. Some carried crystals, others tied little bags of herbs to their belts or hung them above doorways. Astrologers were consulted to determine whether the alignment of the planets had ushered in the pestilence. Farmers burned fires of juniper or sweet, smelling wood to purify the air. Mothers marked children with the sign of the cross in chalk, believing it would shield them. In times of desperation, even the simplest ritual carried the weight of hope. Fatalism, however, was never far behind. When prayers seemed unanswered and remedies proved useless, many concluded that the plague was the will of God, unavoidable and absolute. Chroniclers describe people resigning themselves to death, speaking calmly of their fate, arranging their own burials, even digging graves for themselves while still alive. Some households locked their doors and waited together, unwilling to flee or fight, convinced that their destiny was already written. Such fatalism was not necessarily despair. It was, in a way, a kind of peace, a surrender to forces beyond human control. At the same time, faith shaped how people interpreted survival. If a household escaped infection while neighbors perished, it was seen as a miracle, a sign of divine favor. Survivors often gave thanks with donations to churches, pilgrimages, or the commissioning of votive paintings. Towns that endured particularly severe outbreaks sometimes built new chapels or altars in gratitude for their eventual deliverance. The landscape of Europe still bears these traces: small shrines by crossroads, statues of saints erected in plague years, churches adorned with murals of supplicants kneeling before holy figures. But faith could divide as much as it comforted. When calamity struck, questions of blame arose. Was the plague punishment for the sins of the community? Was it the fault of heretics, of Jews, of lepers, of foreigners? Accusations sometimes flared into violence, as frightened populations searched for scapegoats. Religious fervor, combined with fear, could turn deadly. Pogroms erupted in parts of Europe, and outcasts already on the margins of society bore the brunt of collective panic. Faith, which gave hope to many, also sharpened suspicion and cruelty in others. Plague doctors themselves often witnessed this blend of devotion and despair. They entered homes where crucifixes hung beside amulets of crystal, where prayers mingled with the smoke of burning herbs. They saw families kneeling together, rosaries clutched in trembling hands, even as fever consumed them. They heard whispered confessions, final prayers, desperate bargains with heaven. For the doctor, faith was both a solace and a reminder of limits. No matter how many poultices or bleedings he administered, the ultimate judgment lay in hands unseen. Yet, in retrospect, faith was not simply a matter of failed prayers or misplaced hope. It provided a framework for enduring the incomprehensible. Ritual gave shape to grief. Processions gave communities a sense of unity. Saints gave sufferers figures to whom they could turn when all else seemed lost. Even fatalism, for those who embraced it, offered a way to face death without terror. Faith, in its many forms, was the invisible companion that walked beside the plague, whispering comfort, demanding repentance, offering explanations where none could be found. Today, when we look back at that era, we may be tempted to see only the superstition, the desperate measures that seem quaint or futile in the light of modern medicine. Yet if we listen more closely, we may hear something familiar, for when illness strikes even now, we still seek patterns, meaning, and reassurance. We still light candles, whisper prayers, wear charms, or trust in rituals that soothe us as much as they heal us. Faith and fatalism remain part of the human response to suffering, bridging the gap between what we know and what we fear. And so, the legacy of faith during plague years was not only in the cathedrals filled with incense, or the penitents crying in the streets. It was in the resilience of the human spirit, which sought hope even in the darkest hours. The plague tested belief, reshaped it, sometimes twisted it into cruelty, but also deepened it in ways that carried forward into art, worship, and memory. It is a reminder that, even when medicine fails, the heart still seeks comfort in the unseen, and the soul still longs for meaning in the face of mortality. To imagine the plague doctor is to imagine a figure moving steadily through streets where others dared not tread. Cloaked in layers of waxed fabric, gloved, masked, and carrying a staff, he seemed impervious, almost inhuman. Yet beneath the beak and robe was a man, and with him came a private burden far heavier than the tools he carried. The dread of the plague was not only in the infected houses he entered, but in the silence of his own thoughts when he returned to solitude. At first, the dread was subtle, a whisper in the mind. A new physician, freshly contracted, might tell himself that he was doing noble work, that the herbs in his mask would shield him, that his calling would outweigh his fears. But the first house he entered quickly stripped away illusions. The stench of sickness, the hollow eyes of the dying, the cries of the grieving, these were enough to shake any confidence. Each patient became a mirror, reflecting the doctor's own possible fate. Dread grew with familiarity, not lessened by it. To walk daily among the dying was to carry death like a shadow. Some doctors recorded in their notes that the mask, while meant to protect, also trapped them in a cage of smell and sound. Muffled wails, the sweetness of rotting flesh, the acrid bite of smoke and vinegar. Every sense was overwhelmed, and every step deeper into the streets of plague was a step closer to despair. Loneliness deepened the burden. Often forbidden from mingling with townsfolk outside their duties, plague doctors lived on the margins of the very communities they served. Contracts sometimes required them to remain apart, eating and sleeping in separate quarters. Neighbors looked at them with suspicion, as though they carried pestilence with them wherever they went. Even when not shunned outright, they were avoided. A man could fulfill his duty by day and return at night to a room utterly silent, where his own heartbeat was the only company. The dread was sharpened by knowledge, or rather, by the limits of it. Doctors understood that their remedies often failed, that the humors they tried to balance refused to obey their theories. Every patient lost was a quiet accusation. Not enough was known, not enough could be done. The physician's art, so respected in calmer times, seemed powerless against the plague's relentless march. To feel useless in the face of suffering was a wound to the spirit as deep as any the body could endure. Fear for their own lives gnawed at them constantly. They knew that many of their colleagues succumbed. Some lasted weeks, others months, a rare few years. The mask was a symbol of protection, but also a reminder of vulnerability. It was needed because danger was everywhere. Each cough from a patient, each brush of a hand, each moment spent in a room heavy with breath was a roll of unseen dice. At night, lying awake, the doctor could not help but wonder, had the sickness already entered him? Was that ache in his chest just fatigue, or the first sign of contagion? And yet, duty demanded they return again the next morning. Civic authorities expected them to continue, families begged for their visits, and their contracts bound them. Some found strength in ritual, the careful donning of the robe, the stuffing of herbs into the mask, the steady tapping of the staff as they walked. Routine became armor for the mind. Others clung to faith, whispering prayers before entering a house, asking for divine protection when their earthly measures failed. A few numbed themselves with drink or with detachment, suppressing sympathy to survive the endless tide of sorrow. There were moments, too, of breaking. Chroniclers mention doctors who fled their posts, abandoning contracts and vanishing into the countryside. Others wrote of physicians who fell into melancholy, walking the streets like ghosts, even while still alive. Some recorded their experiences in journals, perhaps as a way to purge the dread, to set it down on paper, rather than carry it always in memory. The words they left behind are filled with both clinical observation and raw anguish. Yet it would be wrong to say the dread entirely crushed them. In many, it was transformed into a strange kind of resilience. To see death daily was to become intimate with it, to strip away its surprises. The dread never vanished, but it became a companion, unwanted, but familiar. Some doctors found a grim peace in the work, a sense that if they must face fear, at least they did so in service of others. Imagine, then, a plague doctor at the end of his day. He removes his heavy garments, washes with vinegar, and sits alone by the dim light of a candle. Outside, the streets are quiet save for the tolling of a bell, another soul gone. He writes a note in his ledger, names of the dead, details of their symptoms, fragments of a world unraveling. Then he pauses, pen hovering, and whispers a prayer. Not for his patients this time, but for himself. He does not know if he will live to see the pestilence end. He only knows that tomorrow, when the sun rises, he will put on the mask once more. The dread of the plague doctor was not the dread of a coward, but the dread of a man forced to face, day after day, the limits of his power and the certainty of his mortality. It was a burden both crushing and clarifying. In the stillness of those dark years, the doctor's dread was the silent echo beneath every visit, every breath, every step into another infected home. In the swirling chaos of plague years, authority sought anchors, figures who could restore a sense of order amid the terror. The plague doctor, for all his eerie garb and questionable remedies, was one such figure. He stood not merely as a physician, but as a representative of civic will, a symbol that governments, councils, and churches were not powerless in the face of catastrophe. Yet his relationship with authority was complex. He was both empowered by it and constrained by it, trusted and distrusted in equal measure. City governments were often the first to turn to plague doctors. Faced with rising deaths and public panic, councils drew up contracts, promising wages, and sometimes lodging in exchange for medical service. These documents survive in archives, their language precise and pragmatic. A doctor would be paid so many florins per month, provided with protective clothing, and instructed to treat the sick without partiality. Some contracts even specified what would happen to the doctor's belongings if he died on duty, usually seized by the city to cover debts. This official arrangement gave the doctor an air of authority, but it also revealed how expendable he was in the eyes of those who hired him. Governments used plague doctors not only as healers, but as record keepers. They were expected to tally the dead, report on the spread of illness, and sometimes even certify burials. In this role, they became bureaucratic instruments, translating human suffering into numbers for officials to study. It was a heavy task, stripping death of its individuality, yet it allowed authorities to grasp the scale of the disaster. In the ledger of a plague doctor, names became statistics, and statistics became the basis for decrees. The church, too, had a complicated relationship with these masked figures. On one hand, clergy recognized their necessity. Priests themselves often perished in great numbers, and plague doctors helped fill the void, tending to the sick when the sacraments could not always be administered. On the other hand, the church sometimes viewed their methods with suspicion. Remedies involving astrology, exotic herbs, or chemical concoctions, skirted the edge of what was considered orthodox. A doctor's reliance on secular knowledge, rather than divine intervention, could be seen as troubling. Still, when death swept through monasteries and parishes, even the most devout recognized the value of any who dared enter the sick room. Among the ruling classes, plague doctors were a double-edged tool. Lords and princes employed them as signs of their concern for subjects, a way to demonstrate governance in action. To hire a plague doctor was to show that the ruler cared, that measures were being taken, however desperate. Yet the same rulers often kept their distance, ensuring that the doctor's work remained among the common folk, rather than in the palaces. Authority embraced the symbolism of the plague doctor, while quietly maintaining its own safety. The people themselves viewed the authority of the plague doctor with ambivalence. His mask and robes set him apart, marking him as both official and uncanny. To see him enter a neighborhood was to know death had already arrived, for he was summoned only when illness was rampant. His staff, used to prod the sick without direct touch, seemed as much a weapon as an instrument of care. In him, authority appeared in its most unsettling form: distant, shrouded, powerful yet impersonal. Some households welcomed his presence with gratitude, others shrank from it, whispering that he carried contagion rather than cures. There was also the matter of discipline. Authorities often gave plague doctors the power to enforce certain measures: quarantines, the inspection of houses, even the decision to wall up the sick with their families to contain the spread. In this role, the doctor became an agent of control, not merely of healing. His visits could mean not relief but confinement, his word carrying the weight of civic decree. To be marked by his presence was to be marked by the state itself. And yet, for all their ties to authority, plague doctors were rarely granted lasting honor. Few were remembered by name, fewer still rose to positions of prominence afterward. They were functionaries, summoned in times of need, dismissed in times of health. Authority valued their service but not their legacy. Once the plague receded, their contracts ended, their robes were packed away or destroyed, and their names slipped quietly back into obscurity. Still, their role left echoes. In the administrative records of cities, in the decrees of councils, in the sermons of bishops, the figure of the plague doctor appears as a reminder of how authority sought to manage catastrophe. He was at once healer, statistician, enforcer, and symbol. Through him, governments and churches declared, "We are not helpless, we will act." Whether those actions saved lives or not mattered less than the reassurance they provided. Imagine a town council chamber in the midst of an outbreak. The air is tense, councillors arguing over quarantines, merchants fretting over trade, priests urging processions. At the center sits a masked figure, silent, waiting. His duty is not to speak policy, but to walk the streets, to carry out the decisions made in this chamber. He is their extension, their shadow in the alleys and sick rooms. Authority, which prefers to remain distant from contagion, has found in him a surrogate. And so the plague doctor's connection to authority was both empowering and isolating. He carried the weight of civic expectation, but little of its protection. He bore the robes of office, but not the honor that usually accompanied them. In his lonely rounds, he was the embodiment of authority's attempt to touch the untouchable, to impose order on chaos. The echoes of that authority linger still, in the very way we remember him. For the plague doctor is not recalled as a man, but as an institution, a mask, a role, a symbol of governance in the face of fear. He was less an individual than a vessel for the decisions of councils and churches, his humanity hidden as thoroughly as his face behind the beat. Behind the long mask and the stiff layers of protective robes, the plague doctor was still a man. He carried within him the same hungers and affections as any other. The need for warmth, for friendship, for love. Yet his profession, his very appearance, conspired against these simple human comforts. To live as a plague doctor was to live at a distance. From neighbors, from kin, and often from one's own heart. Some were young men just beginning their careers, drawn into the work by circumstance. They left behind sweethearts, wives, or fiancés as when summoned to serve in stricken cities. The contracts they signed often demanded that they remain in quarantine themselves, forbidden to mingle freely, lest they carry disease from one house to another. Letters might pass through guarded gates, their words smeared by trembling hands, but touch, embrace, and presence were denied. To love a plague doctor was to love a ghostly figure glimpsed across a courtyard, waving from behind barred doors. Others entered the role already burdened with solitude. A barber, surgeon widowed by early death, an apothecary without family, a scholar unwed and uninsured. For them, the plague offered a strange kind of belonging. If they could not find closeness in ordinary life, perhaps they might find meaning in service. Yet even in this, loneliness shadowed them. The patients they tended rarely offered gratitude. The healthy avoided them. The dying could not hold their hands for long. Companionship slipped through their grasp as quickly as life itself. Imagine, for a moment, the doctor's return home after a day among the afflicted. He removes the beaked mask, the stiff leather gloves, the wide-brimmed hat. His skin is damp with sweat, his hair matted, his eyes wary. He longs for a familiar voice, a soft word, the comfort of another's presence. Yet in his lodgings, often provided by the city, he finds only silence. Perhaps a servant leaves bread and ale at the door, retreating before he arrives. Perhaps no one comes at all. He eats alone, speaks to no one, and prepares once more to face the dark streets. Some doctors tried to preserve ties to those they loved. In letters that survive, one finds tenderness and longing. A father writes to his children, instructing them to study diligently, even as he fears he will never see them grown. A husband writes to his wife of the birdsong, outside his window, as though clinging to beauty in the midst of despair. These glimpses remind us that plague doctors were not faceless specters, but men caught between duty and desire, between love and its absence. Loneliness also crept in more subtle ways. To wear the mask was to be hidden, to erase the self behind an image of authority. Strangers saw not a man, but a figure of dread. Children cried at the sight, adults looked away. The doctor's humanity, his smile or frown, his youth or age, all were concealed. In a world where recognition was fleeting and human bonds fragile, such concealment deepened the sense of isolation. To be known only as the plague doctor was to be unknown entirely, and yet love sometimes persisted. There are tales, half legendary, of women who tended to plague doctors when they themselves fell ill, refusing to abandon them, though it meant near, certain death. There are stories of doctors who returned home after years of service to find sweethearts who had waited, faithful against all odds. Whether myth or truth, such accounts speak to the human longing that endures even in the darkest times. Love, though thwarted, sought cracks through which to shine. For most, however, loneliness became a companion as constant as the staff they carried. Some coped by turning inward, writing notes, studying texts, or recording observations. Their journals, filled with cramped handwriting, became substitutes for conversation. Others prayed, whispering to God in the long hours of night, asking not only for protection but for solace. Still others grew hardened, wrapping themselves not only in robes, but in emotional armor, distancing themselves from affection to survive the weight of absence. This loneliness had consequences. The lack of human closeness could dull empathy, making some doctors brusque, mechanical in their work. Others, overwhelmed by longing, grew reckless, throwing aside precautions to sit beside a patient, to hold a hand, to hear a last word. Between detachment and desperation, they navigated the perilous waters of isolation. Love and loneliness also shaped how they were remembered. Rarely do we find songs or stories celebrating plague doctors as tender figures. Instead, they are recalled as eerie, almost inhuman silhouettes. Yet behind those silhouettes were men who dreamed of the same comforts we do today: a warm hearth, a shared meal, a hand clasped in theirs. Their absence in our collective memory speaks to how loneliness erases not only joy but legacy. Still, if we listen carefully to the past, we can hear the echoes of their longings. In the quill scratches of a letter, in the faint line of a contract, where a doctor asked for wages to support his wife, in the whispered rumors of hearts left waiting, there resides proof that love persisted, however strained. Loneliness could not wholly extinguish the yearning for connection. And perhaps, in a way, their loneliness was part of their sacrifice. By holding themselves apart, by accepting a life of distance, they created a fragile barrier of safety for others. In their solitude lay a form of love, not romantic, not familial, but civic, communal, almost sacrificial. They gave up the warmth of companionship so that others might keep it, if fate allowed. Thus, when we remember the plague doctor as a grim spectre, let us also remember him as a man sometimes in love, often lonely, always human. Beneath the mask beat a heart no less tender than our own, yearning for touch, for voice, for closeness. His story reminds us that even in times of plague, the deepest battles are often not against disease, but against the silence it leaves between souls. Of all the burdens a plague doctor carried, perhaps none was so constant, so unavoidable, as the smell. Sight could be blurred by smoke, touch dulled by leather gloves, sound muffled by the layers of a mask. But smell seeped through everything. It was the invisible reminder of death that clung to streets, houses, and the very air. To walk as a plague doctor was to live in a world saturated with odor, a world where every breath carried the weight of decay. In crowded towns, the first scent was often that of rot. Bodies could not always be buried swiftly. Graves overflowed, and carts piled high with corpses stood waiting for mass pits to be dug. Even in death, the plague announced itself through the stench of putrefaction. Sweet, sickly, and inescapable, it drifted through alleys and over walls, lingering long after the dead had been carried away. The doctor, arriving at a patient's home, would already know what awaited inside, not by sight, but by smell. Within the sick room, odors multiplied. The sharp reek of sweat, heavy and sour, mixed with the iron tang of blood from opened buboes. Herbal poultices gave off acrid fumes, while burning tallow candles added their greasy smoke to the air. Bedsheets, unwashed for days, held layers of illness, breath, pus, vomit. To step across the threshold was to be enveloped in a cloud of sickness, thick and suffocating. Many doctors wrote of gagging within their masks, struggling to keep down their own bile as they attempted to work. The beaked mask itself was devised as a defense against such corruption. Packed with herbs, flowers, spices, and sometimes vinegar-soaked cloth, it was thought to purify the air before it reached the lungs. Doctors stuffed lavender, rose petals, mint, camphor, or cloves into the hollow beak. Some added strong, smelling resins, myrrh, frankincense, or even garlic. The result was a pungent bouquet, meant to drown out the stench of decay with perfumes. But the mask could not wholly banish the smell. The herbs dulled the edges, yet behind them lurked the unmistakable undertone of sickness, slipping in like an unwelcome guest. To medieval minds, these smells were not merely unpleasant, they were dangerous. The theory of miasma, bad air, held that foul odors themselves caused disease. Thus, the plague doctor feared the smell not only for its discomfort, but for its supposed power to corrupt his body. Every whiff of rot, every breath of sour sweat, was imagined as a direct assault on his health. The herbs in the beak, the fires in the streets, even the carrying of nosegays by ordinary citizens, all were weapons in this unseen war against invisible vapors. The streets themselves became battlegrounds of odor. Fires were lit in marketplaces to drive out pestilence with smoke. Barrels of pitch and resin burned day and night, filling the air with a choking haze. Vinegar was splashed on walls, and buckets of lime scattered on refuse. Animals added to the confusion. Pigs and goats driven through alleys in hopes they would absorb the contagion left their own sharp stench behind. To the plague doctor, moving from house to house, the town became a shifting mixture of rotten remedy, each breath an uncertain gamble. Smell also served as a grim guide. A faint sweetness at a doorway might mean the family within had already perished, their bodies lying unattended. A sudden waft of iron and earth could mark the opening of a new mass grave. The doctor learned to read the world through his nose, knowing where death had passed even before he saw its marks. In some places, the stench carried across fields, warning villages of approaching plague carts before they were visible on the horizon. And the odor clung. No matter how he tried, the plague doctor could not escape it. His leather robes absorbed the scent of sweat and smoke. His gloves carried the memory of poultices and wounds. Even after he stripped them away, washed in vinegar, and hung the garments out to air, the smell lingered. It lodged in his nostrils, haunted his dreams, followed him into the rare moments of rest. Some wrote that they could never again endure certain scents, garlic, vinegar, or cloves, without recalling the plague. This saturation of smell had its toll on the spirit. The constant assault eroded appetite. Many doctors lost weight simply from being unable to stomach food after hours in the sick room. Sleep was troubled, for the mind, dulled by fatigue, conjured odors even in the dark. A loaf of bread might smell faintly of decay, a flask of wine of sweat. Loneliness was made sharper by this, for the comfort of shared meals or fireside company was tainted by the fear that the foulness followed him everywhere. Yet, amid this overwhelming sensory world, the plague doctor persevered. He adapted, learned to breathe shallowly, to pace himself, to rely on his mask as both shield and psychological crutch. The mask did not only filter the air, it offered a kind of ritual, a reminder that he was protected, that he could endure another day. The herbs inside, however imperfect, became companions, familiar scents against the chaos beyond. In a way, they were as much for the mind as for the body, a fragile defense against despair. In remembering the plague doctor, we see not only a figure of eerie appearance, but a man who lived in a sea of odor, struggling with every breath. The smell of death was his constant companion, more loyal than love, more relentless than fear. It reminded him of the stakes of his work, of the fragility of life, and of the inescapable reality of mortality. And so, when the image of the beaked mask lingers in our imagination, let us not think only of its shape, but of its purpose. It was not a mere costume. It was a shield against the overwhelming weight of the world's foulest scents. Within its hollow beak lay a fragile attempt to carve out a pocket of sweetness amid the stench of despair, a small gesture of defiance against the smell of death that seemed to saturate the very air of plague-stricken Europe. In times of terror, when reason falters and explanations fail, superstition blossoms. The plague years were fertile soil for such beliefs, for no one truly understood the cause of the catastrophe. Into this vacuum stepped figures both feared and revered, among them, the plague doctor. His strange costume, his silence, and his association with death lent him an aura that ordinary people struggled to interpret. Some saw in him a servant of mercy. Others whispered he was a sorcerer, a harbinger, even a collector of souls. The mask itself became an object of speculation. Its beaked shape, stuffed with pungent herbs, was to physicians a tool against disease. But to the common eye, it seemed monstrous, bird-like, almost otherworldly. Children hid behind their mothers at the sight. Gossip grew that the doctor was imitating carrion birds, those scavengers that circled battlefields and plagues alike, feeding on the dead. Perhaps, some muttered, he was not protecting himself from pestilence at all, but channeling it, drawing illness into his beak to carry elsewhere. Others whispered of darker arts. The staff the doctor carried, used to prod patients without touching them, resembled a wand in the fevered imagination of the fearful. To see him raise it, pointing toward a house, was enough for neighbors to murmur that he was casting spells. When he left, and the family within soon perished, the connection seemed obvious. His gesture had doomed them. Logic and chance played little role in minds already clouded by dread. Superstitions clung not only to the doctor's appearance, but to his very presence. To cross paths with him in the street was considered an ill omen. Housewives shut shutters when his shadow fell across their doors. Merchants closed stalls, fearing that his gaze would taint their wares. A man who shook hands with a plague doctor, or dared to touch his robes, was said to have invited death within the week. Whether people avoided him out of rational fear of contagion, or out of belief in mystical danger hardly mattered. The effect was the same. He walked in isolation, shunned by those he served. Some even believed that plague doctors were hired, not to heal but to harvest. Their ledgers of the dead, their nightly rounds, their constant presence at gravesides, made them seem like agents of fate, scribes of mortality rather than physicians. Rumors spread that they profited from death itself, that their contracts with the city included secret rewards for each victim recorded. A doctor's ink, stained hands became suspect. His tallying of names interpreted not as civic duty, but as a ritual of enumeration, a spell that claimed lives by writing them down. The church added its own caution. While many clergy acknowledged the usefulness of doctors, sermons sometimes warned against trusting too fully in their arts. Remedies involving astrological charts, chemical concoctions, or exotic herbs could seem perilously close to sorcery. A doctor who burned resins or traced diagrams in the air might be accused of dabbling in forbidden knowledge. The line between medicine and magic, already thin in medieval eyes, blurred further when desperation reigned. For their part, plague doctors often endured these suspicions silently. They had little choice. To protest too loudly might invite accusations of witchcraft, or worse. Some tried to soften their image, carrying crosses or prayer beads, reminding the public of their piety. Others leaned into the aura of mystery, using it as a shield. If people feared them, at least they gave wide berth, which might mean fewer confrontations and less resistance to their work. Fear, after all, could be a kind of power. Superstitions also surrounded their remedies. A poultice that healed one patient became whispered of as miraculous. If it failed another, it was cursed. To hand someone a vial of vinegar, or a sprig of rosemary, was to offer not just a medicine but a talisman. Ordinary people tucked herbs given by doctors into amulets, hung them over cradles, or buried them beneath doorsteps to ward off pestilence. The line between prescription and charm blurred until the two were indistinguishable. In the villages, stories grew with retelling. Some spoke of a doctor whose mask glowed in the moonlight, as if lit from within. Others told of one who never aged, appearing in town after town across decades unchanged, as though death itself preserved him. These tales spread because they gave shape to fear. The doctor, like the plague, was incomprehensible, and so imagination clothed him in myth. Yet superstition was not always hostile. Some households welcomed him as a figure of protection, believing that his very presence kept demons at bay. To them, the mask was a shield not only against disease, but against evil spirits. They invited him to bless thresholds, to wave his staff over children, to leave behind scraps of herbs as guardians. In these cases, the plague doctor was less a physician than a holy talisman, his rituals woven into the fabric of folk belief. But whether feared or revered, the common thread was that the plague doctor was never seen as ordinary. He was set apart, clothed not only in leather and cloth, but in the projections of a terrified society. He became whatever people needed him to be: scapegoat, sorcerer, omen, guardian. His real work, painful uncertain, often fruitless, was overshadowed by the stories whispered about him. And so, when we think of superstition in the age of plague, we must remember how it shaped not just the disease, but those who fought it. The plague doctor's mask was more than a tool. It was a canvas for imagination. Onto its beak and lenses, people painted their hopes and fears, their need for explanation in a world gone silent with grief. In that sense, superstition itself became a kind of survival. To call the doctor a sorcerer was to give the plague a face, to believe that someone wielded control, however dark, over the chaos. In the end, superstition did not cure, but it gave shape to the shapeless, a story to the incomprehensible. And the plague doctor, silent and shrouded, walked at its center, carrying both the weight of death and the burden of myth. When the plague swept through cities and villages, no defense seemed strong enough to hold it back. Medicine faltered, prayer often went unanswered, and despair grew like a second contagion. Out of this desperation arose one of the oldest weapons humanity has wielded against epidemic disease: quarantine. It was a word of power and fear, a practice that carried both hope and cruelty. And in the heart of it stood the plague doctor, tasked not only with treating the sick, but also with enforcing separation. The origins of quarantine were pragmatic, born in the port cities of the Mediterranean. Venice, ever mindful of trade and survival, declared that ships arriving from infected regions must wait 40 days before unloading. A 40 giorni. The number had symbolic weight as well as practical purpose, echoing biblical spans of trial and purification. In those 40 days, either sickness would appear, or it would pass. From harbors, the practice spread inland, transforming not only commerce but daily life. For the plague doctor, quarantine was not an abstract policy, but a reality that shaped every street he walked. He became an inspector of households, peering into rooms where families huddled together. His presence often marked the beginning of confinement. With a gesture of his staff, he might order doors sealed, shutters nailed shut, and guards posted outside. Within, the healthy and the sick alike were bound to one fate: to endure isolation until either recovery or death freed them. These measures were harsh, and doctors knew it. They watched as children who showed no symptoms were locked inside with dying parents, as servants begged for release, as households pleaded through barred windows. Yet the logic of containment left little room for compassion. To let one out was to risk many more lives. The doctor, himself separated from ordinary society by mask and robe, became the agent of this greater separation, a living boundary between the quarantined and the free. Quarantine did not stop at individual houses. Whole neighborhoods were sometimes walled off, with guards patrolling gates, and no one permitted to enter or leave. Markets were relocated, goods fumigated, letters passed through vinegar baths before delivery. The very rhythm of life altered, reduced to exchanges at a distance. The doctor's work, once centered in the sick room, expanded to overseeing these wider quarantines, ensuring compliance and reporting to councils. He became a sentinel as much as a healer, his presence a reminder of the invisible barriers now dividing communities. Yet quarantine was never foolproof. Rats slipped through walls, fleas traveled unnoticed, and contagion spread despite the strictest measures. This failure often turned frustration against the doctors themselves. If plague appeared in a quarantined street, neighbors accused the doctor of negligence, or worse, of carrying infection with him. He became both enforcer and scapegoat. Caught in the web of measures meant to contain the very threat he risked his life to confront. Life inside quarantine was grim. Food was delivered to doorsteps, often by watchmen who left baskets and hurried away. The sick and the well shared the same cramped spaces, and fear gnawed at every interaction. Some prayed together, others turned on one another, suspicion mingling with grief. From outside, the doctor might hear voices rising within, or silence settling too heavily, signaling that death had already come. He recorded these cases in his ledger, noting who survived, who perished, and who vanished into the silence of confinement. For the doctors themselves, quarantine meant isolation of another kind. They were expected to avoid taverns, churches, and markets. Their lodgings were sometimes marked, their movements restricted. They lived under a cloud of suspicion, as though they themselves were contagion embodied. In a sense, their entire existence was a quarantine, set apart from ordinary life, bound by duty to remain at a distance. Their masks, their gloves, their very bodies became borders, never crossing fully into the world of the healthy. And yet, quarantine carried a strange kind of order amid the chaos. It gave the illusion of control, a sense that something could be done to resist the tide of death. To know that ships waited offshore, that houses were sealed, that markets were regulated. It reassured those outside the walls, even if the measures worked only imperfectly. The doctor, by enforcing these rules, became part of this fragile structure of hope. He was not only a physician, but a visible emblem of containment. His mask a reminder that society had not wholly surrendered. Quarantine also left its mark on memory. Families who survived remembered the confinement with bitterness, the sense of being prisoners in their own homes. Others recalled it with gratitude, believing that the walls kept them safe. In both cases, the plague doctor's figure lingered, sometimes as jailer, sometimes as guardian. His staff, once a tool of medicine, was remembered as a rod of separation, drawing lines that shaped lives and deaths alike. Looking back, we can see quarantine as both a necessity and a cruelty, a blunt instrument wielded against an enemy no one fully understood. For the plague doctor, it was yet another burden on his already heavy shoulders. He bore not only the cries of the sick, but the accusations of the confined, the suspicion of neighbors, and the loneliness of his own isolation. He became, in effect, the human face of quarantine, masked, distant, and unavoidable. And perhaps this is why his image endures. The beaked mask, the leather robe, the staff, they are not only symbols of plague but of separation. They remind us of the walls we build in fear, the distances we enforce in the name of survival. The plague doctor was both inside and outside these walls, a solitary figure bridging the gap, embodying the painful choices a society must make when survival is weighed against compassion. In times when words fail, when despair runs deeper than language, humanity often turns to song. The plague, with its relentless toll, left behind a chorus of mourning that echoed across Europe. It was not music in the sense of celebration, but in lamentation, a raw, trembling voice that sought to shape grief into something bearable. For the plague doctor, who walked daily among the sick and dying, these songs became part of the soundscape of his existence. Mourning began in the home. Families gathered around the dying to chant prayers, their voices quivering with fear. Mothers hummed lullabies not to soothe sleep, but to ease the passage from life to death. Fathers recited psalms in cracked tones, sometimes alone in rooms emptied of children. The plague doctor, entering these spaces, often paused to hear the fragile melodies, knowing that music offered a balm his medicines could not provide. In the streets, the sound of grief spread further. Funerals multiplied until they could no longer be conducted with individual care, yet communities clung to ritual through song. Bells tolled endlessly, their peals blurring into a single mournful drone. Priests led processions with chants of requiem, voices weaving between coughs and sobs. Ordinary people joined in, their rough tones rising like smoke, filling alleys and courtyards with the music of collective loss. Dirges took on many forms. Some were formal hymns, drawn from the liturgy. Others were folk laments, improvised by widows, sung in dialects thick with sorrow. There were simple refrains that children repeated, half play, half grief, turning tragedy into rhyme. The most famous of these, Ring a Ring O Roses, though its exact origins are debated, reflects how deeply the plague imprinted itself upon memory and song. For those who lived through it, rhyme and melody offered a way to hold despair at arm's length, to transform death into a pattern of words. The plague doctor became, unwittingly, part of this music. His arrival at a house often silenced laughter, replaced with whispered prayers. His departure, after declaring a death, set neighbors chanting blessings or singing brief invocations. He did not sing himself. His mask muffled his voice. His duties allowed little room for such expression. But he moved through a world suffused with it. The lament was his constant companion, as much a part of his work as the herbs in his beak or the ledger at his side. Sometimes, songs of mourning became acts of defiance. When authorities forbade public gatherings for fear of contagion, people still gathered at windows or courtyards to sing to the dead. They risked fines and punishment, but grief demanded release. To sing was to say we are still human, even in the shadow of pestilence. The plague doctor, passing by, might hear these forbidden harmonies drifting into the night, fragile and courageous. Music also shaped memory. Families remembered not only the faces of the lost, but the songs sung at their passing. A mother's humming lingered long after her voice was stilled. A chant heard outside a shuttered house could cling to a survivor for life, woven into their sense of tragedy. For the doctor too, melodies clung like shadows. He could forget a patient's name, but a widow's wail might echo in his mind for years. Professional mourners sometimes appeared, women hired to keen over graves. Their high, piercing cries gave voice to anguish too sharp for words. Doctors, scribes, and priests alike recorded these keens, noting how they rose above the toll of bells and the murmur of prayer. To some, these cries were unsettling, too raw, too close to madness. To others, they were essential, giving shape to the chaos of grief. Even silence could be musical. Entire quarters of cities fell so still that the absence of sound became a dirge of its own. The doctor, walking through abandoned streets, heard only the scrape of his boots, the faint rustle of his robe. The silence pressed upon him like a hymn of emptiness, a song sung not by voices but by absence. It was, in its way, the loudest mourning of all. The repetition of song, like the repetition of loss, created a rhythm to plague life. Each morning began with bells, each evening ended with chants. The doctor's rounds moved in time with this music, his steps echoing in streets alive with lament. Sometimes he paused at a doorway, listening as a family sang prayers over a body he had only just declared gone. He knew his mask made him faceless, but in those moments, he felt like part of the ritual, silent witness to the last human expression of love. To modern ears, these songs might seem unbearably bleak, but for those who lived them, they were lifelines. Song allowed the living to speak with the dead, to assure them they were not forgotten. It offered structure in a world undone, a measure of beauty amid ruin. Even the plague doctor, though rarely given to such sentiments, must have felt it. Beneath the weight of superstition, duty and dread, he walked through a city where grief had been set to music, where sorrow found voice, where death was always accompanied by song. In the end, the plague was not silent. It was cacophony, coughs and cries, bells and chants, wails and whispers. And at its heart, threading through the noise, were the songs of mourning. They did not cure, nor did they prevent, but they gave shape to suffering, carried grief beyond the walls of the sick room, and left behind echoes that outlived the pestilence itself. For the plague doctor, those echoes never faded. Long after the plague ebbed, he carried with him the memory of voices raised in lamentation. They were the soundtrack of his labor, the chorus of his burden, the music of a world undone, yet still striving to endure. If the plague had a voice, it was not only in the cries of the dying or the songs of mourning. Just as powerful, and perhaps more terrifying, was its silence. For silence carried a weight that pressed upon the living, a suffocating presence that filled empty streets, darkened homes, and the hearts of those who remained. For the plague doctor, silence was as constant as sound, waiting at the edges of his daily rounds, falling over him like a shroud the moment bells stopped ringing. In bustling medieval towns, silence had once been rare. Streets were normally alive with chatter and haggling, with hammer on anvil, with church bells and children's laughter. But during plague years, those familiar sounds receded, replaced by stillness. Whole districts fell quiet as households shuttered their doors. Market squares lay empty, their stalls deserted. The footsteps of the doctor echoed unnaturally loud, bouncing off walls as though the city itself had become a hollow shell. The silence was not uniform. It was punctuated by sudden interruptions. A cry here, a bell there, the scrape of a cart carrying bodies. But these noises only made the silences between them heavier, as though each pause reminded people of what had been lost. For the plague doctor, moving from one house of sickness to the next, these gaps between sound became the loneliest moments. He found himself listening for voices that never came, watching windows that remained closed, waiting for a city that no longer stirred. Inside homes, silence often struck hardest. He would step into dim chambers where whole families lay motionless, unable to speak from weakness or already gone. The air was thick with stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of cloth or a single ragged breath. Sometimes he moved through these rooms like a phantom, his mask and robe only heightening the impression that he did not belong to the world of the living. He was a figure of soundless duty, measuring pulses that faltered into nothing, writing notes with the scratch of a quill that felt too loud against the hush. Nighttime was worst. After his day's work, when even the bells ceased and the laments dwindled, silence engulfed everything. Streets that once glowed with torches or rang with conversation lay deserted. Even animals seemed subdued, their voices stilled by the weight of pestilence. The doctor, walking home under the pale moon, might hear nothing at all for long stretches, only the soft crunch of his boots. In those moments, silence seemed alive, pressing closer, whispering unspoken fears, "You too will fall. This city is already half a grave." Silence did not only terrify, it could also numb. For some, it became a refuge, a space where grief could be borne without performance. Families too weary to sing or weep simply sat together in quiet, their love expressed in touch rather than voice. The plague doctor sometimes found households sitting in silence by their sick, hands joined, eyes heavy. No lament, no prayer, just the steady endurance of being together. In such rooms, silence was not emptiness but presence, the language of a love too tired for words. Communal silence also held meaning. At times, entire towns agreed to stop bells, to halt chants, to rest from mourning in voice. This was not denial but exhaustion. When lament became constant, silence offered relief. The doctor noticed the difference at once: no tolling, no chants, only a blanket of stillness. For a moment, it seemed as though the plague itself had been paused, though he knew it had not. These silences were fragile truces between the living and their grief. For the plague doctor himself, silence became both enemy and companion. Alone in his quarters, he sometimes feared the stillness, for it allowed his thoughts to grow loud, doubts, regrets, dread of infection. Yet at other times, he sought it. The silence of early morning before his rounds, or of a quiet corner where he could write, gave him a kind of peace. Amid endless cries and bells, the absence of sound could be a balm. Silence was heavy, yes, but it was also steady. Writers of the age sometimes noted the paradox: a world both too loud with death and too quiet with absence. The plague doctor, more than most, lived in that paradox daily. His steps traced a rhythm against silence. His staff tapped like a metronome through empty lanes. He was sound within stillness, movement within stagnation. And though he dreaded it, he also came to expect it. The silence of plagued towns became the background of his life, the canvas on which every sorrowful sound was painted. When the plague finally receded, when people returned to markets and bells rang once more for weddings instead of funerals, silence itself seemed changed. Survivors wrote of how noise felt strange after so long, almost jarring. For the plague doctor, too, the sound of life's return must have been overwhelming. A reminder that the silence he had walked through was not natural but born of catastrophe. He carried that silence within him, even when the world outside no longer did. Thus the silence of the plague was more than absence. It was presence, a palpable, suffocating presence that shaped memory and marked time. It was the pause between cries, the breath before mourning, the vast emptiness left by the vanished. For the plague doctor, silence was as much a part of his work as the cries of the dying. A constant companion he could neither escape nor fully embrace. And in the end, perhaps silence was the true sound of the plague. When the plague finally loosened its grip, when the bells rang less often and life tentatively returned to markets and churches, the figure of the plague doctor did not fade quietly into history. Instead, he lingered in memory, wrapped in a peculiar mixture of awe, suspicion, and unease. His mask, his robes, his silent tread through deserted streets, all these became symbols that outlived the pestilence itself. Yet the men behind the masks often carried not honor, but stigma. For many survivors, the sight of a plague doctor remained bound to grief. He was the messenger of death, the figure who had entered their homes only to declare loved ones gone. Even if he had brought remedies or comfort, his presence became associated with loss. To see the long, beaked mask was to recall funerals, empty houses, and the choking silence of quarantined streets. In memory, the doctor's image hardened into something ominous, almost spectral. He was not remembered as a healer, but as an omen. This reputation was not entirely undeserved. Doctors themselves often admitted they could do little to cure. Their task was largely to record, to witness, to contain. Contracts sometimes specified their duties in grim terms: to certify death, to note symptoms, to enforce quarantine. Families desperate for salvation received, instead, a quiet acknowledgement of mortality. Resentment grew, and even long after the plague's retreat, that bitterness clung to the profession. In towns where plague doctors had perished in service, gratitude sometimes bloomed. Monuments were raised, prayers offered for their souls. But in many more places, memories soared. Survivors whispered of doctors who fled, who charged high fees, or who failed to risk their lives as promised. Even honest physicians could not escape the suspicion that they had profited from despair. The mask, once intended as a barrier of protection, came to symbolize distance, indifference, and fear. Art and literature deepened the stigma. In later centuries, when people looked back on the Black Death and other outbreaks, artists painted plague doctors as grotesque figures. The long beak became a caricature, an emblem of dread rather than of service. In plays and pamphlets, the doctor often appeared as a fool or a fraud, mocked for his ineffective remedies, pitied for his isolation. In carnival masks of Venice, the beaked visage turned into a costume for revelry, its origin in suffering transformed into a parody. Thus, the plague doctor survived in memory not as a man of compassion, but as a strange, half-comical ghost of pestilence. Even in professional circles, stigma lingered. Universities and guilds, proud of their physicians, sometimes sought to distance themselves from plague doctors, treating their contracts as lesser work. To tend the sick in times of pestilence was seen as a necessity, but not as a mark of distinction. Young physicians who had served in plague towns could find themselves looked upon with unease, as though they carried death in their very presence. A paradox emerged. They had risked their lives for civic duty, yet were often met with coldness when the duty was done. For the doctors themselves, the stigma was not only social, but personal. Many returned from their posts haunted, carrying memories of silence and sorrow that they could not easily set aside. They bore the suspicion of their neighbors, the distrust of patients, and the isolation of being forever linked to the mask. Some retreated from medicine altogether, turning to other trades. Others embraced obscurity, leaving little trace of themselves beyond the ink of their contracts. Few achieved the honor or legacy they may once have hoped for. Yet there was also a darker fascination. The plague doctor's image, though tainted by stigma, remained unforgettable. Children whispered stories of them, half in fear, half in awe. Their likeness appeared in marginalia of manuscripts, in the margins of chronicles, in the etchings of later centuries. They became part of folklore, a reminder that death could take on human form, that dread could wear a mask. In this way, stigma and memory entwined, ensuring the plague doctor was never wholly forgotten. The irony is striking. Men who donned their masks to protect themselves and to serve others became symbols not of safety, but of terror. Their presence, meant to reassure civic authorities and organize care, came to represent abandonment and helplessness. The beak of the mask, stuffed with herbs, became instead a bird of ill omen, circling over plague-stricken cities in the imagination of generations. And so, when later outbreaks arose, people remembered the doctors with mixed feelings. Some demanded their return, believing any physician was better than none. Others recoiled at the thought, preferring to rely on prayer or flight rather than entrust their fate to men whose predecessors had failed to cure. The stigma endured, shaping not only memory but expectation. In time, medicine advanced, and the plague doctor's image became obsolete. Germ theory replaced miasma. Hospitals replaced quarantined houses. Professional physicians replaced contract-bound strangers. But the stigma remained embedded in culture. The very phrase, plague doctor, became shorthand for futility, for eerie presence without power. Artists of the Romantic and Gothic eras seized upon the mask as a symbol of dread, transforming the stigma into myth. Yet behind the myth, behind the stigma, were real men. Some compassionate, some cowardly, some skilled, some ignorant. They were not monsters or saints, but ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances. The stigma they bore was as much a reflection of communal grief as of their own failings. People needed someone to embody the trauma of plague, and the doctor, with his bird-like mask and his grim duties, was the most visible candidate. Thus, the lasting stigma of the plague doctor was not simply a judgment on their actions, but a projection of a society's pain. To remember them was to remember death. To distrust them was to distrust the helplessness of an age. And so, centuries later, when the beaked mask appears in art, in costume, or in the imagination, it still carries that weight. A relic of stigma that history has never quite lifted. History is often written in great movements, wars, kings, discoveries, revolutions. Yet sometimes it is the quieter figures, cloaked and masked, walking silently through narrow streets, who leave the most enduring impressions. The plague doctor, both feared and forgotten, stands among them. His story is not one of triumph but of endurance, not of victory but of witness. And perhaps that is why his image lingers in our minds even now, centuries later. When we look back upon him, what do we see? At first, perhaps, only the mask, the long, curved beak, the wide, brimmed hat, the dark robes. It is an image at once eerie and captivating, as though conjured from nightmare. Yet behind that mask was a man, perhaps young, perhaps inexperienced, perhaps deeply afraid. A man who stepped into homes where others dared not tread, who listened to the ragged breath of the dying, who carried notes of the fallen in his ledger. By candlelight, his remedies failed, his theories faltered, his presence was often more omen than cure. And still, he went. He walked where the air was thick with sorrow, where bells tolled endlessly, where silence weighed heavy as stone. He bore the dread of contagion, the suspicion of neighbors, the isolation of duty. He was, in the end, both necessary and unwanted. To some he was a servant of compassion, to others a harbinger of doom. To all, a reminder of the fragility of life. There is a strange comfort in remembering him now. For though his world seems distant, his struggle feels familiar. We too live with invisible threats, with uncertainty, with the ache of not knowing what tomorrow may bring. We too have learned the value of those who serve in times of crisis, even when their tools are imperfect, even when their presence reminds us of danger. In this, the plague doctor is not just a relic of the past, but a mirror of our present. His story also reminds us that history is not only about great victories, but about endurance through failure. He could not cure, but he bore witness. He could not save all, but he tried. And in that effort lies a quiet kind of heroism. The heroism of those who walk forward, even when the path is uncertain. Who do what they can with what little they have. As the centuries passed, the plague doctor's image shifted into symbol and myth. He became a carnival mask, a figure in art, a haunting silhouette in the imagination. People laughed at him, feared him, painted him in grotesque exaggeration. Yet beneath the layers of memory and stigma lies something simple: a man, burdened by fear, trying to serve amid catastrophe. It is worth remembering him not only as symbol, but as person. Tonight, as we reflect on his story, let us picture him not in the chaos of plague, but in the stillness of his solitary room. His robe hangs by the door. His mask rests upon a table. The candle beside him flickers low as he writes in his ledger another name, another date, another entry in the endless catalogue of sorrow. He pauses, listening to the silence beyond his walls, the city hushed under the weight of pestilence. Perhaps he folds his hands, whispers a prayer, or simply closes his eyes for a moment of rest. For tomorrow, he knows, he will rise and walk again. In remembering him, we honor not only his burdens, but the resilience of those who lived through such times. The plague scared Europe, Asia, and Africa, but humanity endured. Out of silence came song, out of fear came ritual, out of devastation came renewal. Life returned, as it always does, tentative at first, then strong. And the figure of the plague doctor remained, half in shadow, half in memory, carrying with him both the dread and the endurance of an age. So as you drift towards sleep, let these reflections settle like dust upon still air. Let the image of the masked doctor fade gently, not as a figure of terror, but as a quiet companion on our journey through the past. His story has been told, his burden acknowledged, his place in history restored to us. Not in fear but in understanding. The world he knew is gone, yet his presence reminds us of a truth that endures, that even in the darkest times, there are those who step forward, imperfect but willing, fragile but determined. They may not always be celebrated, they may even be shunned, but their effort leaves a mark. It shapes the way we remember, the way we endure, the way we find meaning in hardship. And now, the story draws to a close. The candle gutters, the ledger closes, the streets fall still. The plague doctor's footsteps recede into history, leaving us with silence, with memory, with a gentle reminder of resilience. Rest easy, dear listener. The tale is ended. Darkness is not only fear, but also rest, also renewal. May the echoes of history soothe you, may the shadows of the past fade into dreams, and may you wake to light once more.